All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Just briefly want to inform everyone, give everyone a little bit of background about our Prevention Research Center. If you don't already know about us, welcome. We are a network of academic research facilities in the United States that study how people and their communities can avoid or counter risks for chronic illnesses. And we, the Prevention Research Center at Georgia State, is headquartered on the Clarkston campus at Perimeter College. And we work with community organizations, state and local governments, residents, and other partners in Clarkston, Georgia to develop, implement, and evaluate culturally and linguistically appropriate interventions to address the disparities and determinants of health for migrants and refugees, and to disseminate that work at the community, state, and national levels. So we thank you all for joining us for our monthly Brown Bag. This month, we have a wonderful speaker. We're so pleased to welcome Emily Torstveit Ngara, who is an assistant clinical professor and director of the Immigration Clinic here at GSU in the School of Law. She teaches a live client clinic where students represent indigent non-citizens in a variety of immigration matters, honing their skills in interviewing, counseling, fact investigation, legal research, and writing and trial skills. So I will now stop sharing so that Emily, you can share your slides. And Emily, would you prefer that folks hold their questions until the end or raise their hand as you move along?
I guess if we could hold them till the end, that's probably the best, just because there's a lot of stuff to cover. I'm gonna do my best to make it through. And then I guess the only caveat to that is if I use an acronym that people don't know what it means, do feel free to stop me. I'm gonna do my best not to do that, but sometimes I forget that things are acronyms.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Emily. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today to give you a bit of information about the difference between some different immigration statuses that may be applicable to people fleeing Afghanistan, talk a little bit about the options that are available for individuals who are in Afghanistan and those individuals who are here in the United States, and just a little bit about the asylum process and the status of asylum, particularly in the Atlanta area. Asylum is, spoiler alert, one of the forms of relief that is going to be applicable for Afghans. So just to give a little bit of information about the clinic, our clinic opened in January of 2020, so it's a fairly new clinic, but we have, I think, gotten off to a running start. We focus on removal defense, and removal is the euphemism that the law now uses for deportation. So the majority of our clients are in removal proceedings, which means that the government is actively trying to deport them from the United States. They have cases before the immigration court here in Atlanta. The majority of our work focuses on asylum because Atlanta is a particularly difficult location for asylum seekers. For a very long time, the grant rates for asylum cases in Atlanta have hovered somewhere between 2% and 4%. And that's compared to a national average of closer to 30 or 40% of approval rates. So asylum is particularly tricky here in the United States. And so our goal is to take cases with the intention of building a really strong record and then appealing them all the way up to the federal circuit court in the hopes of creating better case law that would then impact people appearing in immigration courts in the 11th Circuit. We also have some cases that are special immigrant juvenile status cases. Those are for children who enter the United States without a parent or guardian and who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both of their parents, and who a state court has found it's not in their best interest to be reunited with that parent or returned to their country of origin. We also have some cases for victims of severe forms of trafficking in humans, which are T visas. So we've got a couple of those cases as well. Our clients come from all over the world. We do have a large number of Central American clients, primarily from the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Those have been the major countries that we've been seeing a surge of asylum seekers from in the past several years. Also, obviously, a lot of Venezuelans and Cubans who are applying for asylum. We also have clients from Africa, and I don't think we have currently, no, we do. We have actually do have an Afghan client as well right now. The clinic takes our cases on referral only. I have found in my years of doing clinical education that it's not the best use of our resources to do our own intake. So we rely on a network of other agencies to send cases our way that they know fit what we're looking to do. We also engage in project work every semester. So that has included a variety of different work from working with Innovation Law Lab's Pro Se Asylum Clinic. Students help people who are not represented complete applications for asylum to submit to the immigration court so that they can at least have their day in court. And it'll also give them some additional time to find an attorney. We also have done work, research work with the City of Atlanta Public Defender's Office, and we're currently putting together a guide for best practices for attorneys and medical providers who are working together to provide supporting evidence for asylum cases in the form of psychological and medical evaluations. So with that out of the way, I'm going to move on to explaining a variety of different immigration statuses. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but it is important, I think, to understand the differences between these various forms of relief because they will be coming up later as we discuss people fleeing Afghanistan. So the first is refugee, and refugees are defined in our code. They're also defined in the Refugee Convention as someone who's outside of their country of origin. So this is not internally displaced people. These are people who are outside their country of origin, and they have a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. They are unable or unwilling to avail themselves of protection from their government, and that has been interpreted to mean that the government is unable or unwilling to protect them in the US. These are folks who are located in refugee camps outside the United States. They are determined to be refugees by the UNHCR and the Department of Homeland Security. They are processed and oriented and all of that outside the US, and then a resettlement agency in the United States is identified, and then they are brought to the US and they enter as refugees. They are eligible for a variety of benefits for a limited period of time, such as housing assistance, employment assistance, Medicaid, food stamps, that sort of thing. And after they have been in refugee status for 1 year, they're eligible to adjust their status to lawful permanent resident status, which is also commonly called a green card. And once they have been then another 4 years in, it's called LPR, lawful permanent resident status, they are eligible to apply for citizenship. An asylee is similar in many ways to a refugee. But they are located in the United States when they apply for asylum, and they have to show that they meet the definition of a refugee. I will get further into the process a little later on. It's a very lengthy process, unfortunately, right now for most people. But after you've been an asylee, after you've been granted asylum, you're eligible for similar benefits to the refugees, except for I don't think housing assistance, but food stamps, Medicaid, employment assistance, that sort of thing. And then after you've been an asylee for 1 year, you are also eligible to apply to adjust your status to lawful permanent resident status. And then 4 years after you're granted that status, you are eligible to apply for citizenship. The special immigrant visa, there are actually 2 different types that are relevant to people in Afghanistan. One is a program that's for translators and interpreters who worked with the US military or the government for more than a year. The other is for people who worked directly, maybe not in an interpreter or translator role, for the US government or a contractor for more than a year. Those individuals have to first get either a recommendation letter if they're applying for the first type of special immigrant visa, or approval from the chief of mission. Once they've got that, then they're able to apply to US Citizenship and Immigration Service, or USCIS, which is sort of the administrative arm of the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States that adjudicates visa applications here. And once the USCIS makes a decision on that application, they then can forward the approval to the National Visa Center, which then begins the consular processing process, where there's usually a medical exam and interviews at the consulate abroad, etc. Once the consular process is complete, then that individual would be able to come to the United States and they would enter as a lawful permanent resident, and after 5 years would be eligible for to apply for naturalization. People who are in the United States can also apply for the special immigrant visa. Their process is a little different. It's the same through applying to USCIS, but if they're in the US, they obviously won't be forced to consular process. They can then submit again to USCIS the application for adjustment of status. And so USCIS would be the ones that would adjudicate that application here in the United States. Humanitarian parole is a form of relief that's available broadly for people who need to come to the United States for some humanitarian reason. So for example, it's often used for people who want to come to the United States to attend to a loved one who is dealing with a serious illness, to attend a funeral, to obtain medical care here in the US themselves. And so that's something that can be applied for with USCIS if the person is abroad. And that's generally people who are still in Afghanistan would be doing that process. And the reason that you would apply to USCIS is because you would be able to then get what's called a boarding foil. It's a document that lets the airline know that you have permission to enter the United States. And most commercial airlines are not going to let someone on the plane unless they have a passport, a visa, or a boarding foil that lets them know that that person is going to be admitted to the United States. Because if they transit people who are not ultimately entitled to enter the United States, then they can be liable for the return trip. You can, if you get to a port of entry, apply directly with Customs and Border Protection, that's CBP, at the port of entry. Humanitarian parole is generally granted for however long they think it's going to take you to do whatever thing it is that you came to the United States to do. So obviously, if it's for attending a funeral, it's going to be a much shorter period of time than if you're seeking to enter to get medical care, for example. I believe that the Afghans who are coming in are primarily being granted humanitarian parole for a period of 2 years, is sort of the general information. It can be renewed, but it is not immigration status. So these individuals would be able to apply for work authorization while they're here on humanitarian parole, but it's not a permanent solution. It's not an immigration status. It doesn't have a pathway to lawful permanent residence or citizenship. And so individuals who are here on humanitarian parole who want to remain here are going to need to submit some other application for immigration benefits. And then lastly, undocumented is the term that is generally used to refer to people who are here in the United States with no lawful immigration status. That could be individuals who enter without inspection by crossing the border, not at a designated border crossing, or people who enter on a valid visa and then overstay the period of time that they're authorized to be here. So the options that are available for Afghans who are in Afghanistan include humanitarian parole. They would need to submit the application to USCIS. There is a filing fee of approximately $700 per person. And my understanding is that there have been something along the lines of 20,000 applications for humanitarian parole submitted in the past several months, which means that that process is likely to take longer than we would hope it would. The USCIS agency in general is understaffed, and things have been taking quite a long time to be processed. The special immigrant visa is still available. You may have heard that that process is also taking an inordinate amount of time. The good news is that people who have a pending SIV can come to the United States and do the adjustment of status process rather than consular processing. That's important, especially because there is currently no consular processing happening in Afghanistan. There is a refugee resettlement priority program that's been put in place for Afghans who work, for example, with non-governmental organizations and don't qualify for the special immigrant visa, or perhaps they worked for the US government for less than a year. So to benefit from the P2 program, first they need an employment certification, and then they need to leave Afghanistan and go to a third country that is doing priority program processing. And as far as I can tell, they have not announced yet which countries those will be, but the idea is that the individual would go to a refugee camp essentially and then be processed through the normal refugee process, although they would be given priority, which would still probably mean at least 2 years worth of processing. P3 program is similar to P2, except for that it's for people who have family in the United States that are here in some sort of status. And so it will sort of allow for reunification with family. Along those lines, there are relative petitions that can be filed. The I-130 is for people, if you're a US citizen, you can apply for your parents if you're over the age of 21, you can apply for your spouse, your minor children who are unmarried, your children over the age of 21 who are unmarried, your married children over the age of 21, and brothers and sisters. However, if you get beyond the immediate relative category, which is parents, spouses, and minor children, there are caps on the number of people who are eligible to come to the US every year. And so there are very long wait times for those categories. If someone is here and has lawful permanent resident status, they are eligible to apply for their spouses and minor children. And I'm not actually sure, I can't remember whether they're able to apply for their children who are over the age of 21, but I can find that out during the question and answer period. People who have green cards do not, their family members don't fall into the immediate relative category, so they are also subject to yearly caps, and so potentially lengthy wait times. I-730s are family relative petitions for people who have refugee or asylee status. You can file those for your spouse and children, minor children who are unmarried, to join you in the US. There are also student and exchange visitor visas that could be for anything from graduate study to seasonal work to visiting scholar type positions. And then there are work visas, both skilled and unskilled visas, although those visas are subject to an annual lottery. There's only a certain number of them available, so people apply and then see whether they're selected. And there are also visas available for people who work for a US-based company who are then transferred to the US. For people who are in the United States, asylum is likely to be one of the big options for people who fear persecution in Afghanistan. Family petitions are also available for people who are here in the United States. It can get complicated. Those folks have to have entered with inspection in order to adjust here in the US if they're immediate relatives, and there are other limitations if you get out of the immediate relative categories. There's the special immigrant visa, which I've discussed before, and then special immigrant juvenile status. So if there is a child under the age of 21 who's unmarried, who has been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both of their parents, and a juvenile court in their state of residence finds that they are dependent on the court, meaning that they grant custody to an individual or a state entity, and then determine that it's not in their best interest to return to Afghanistan, they would be eligible to apply for special immigrant juvenile status, which would then lead them on a path to lawful permanent resident status and eventually naturalization. All right, so just to talk a little bit more about asylum. So you have to show that you have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, and that you are unable or unwilling to avail yourself of the protection of your country of origin because of that persecution. So for Afghans, there are potentially political claims. There are potential particular social group claims. You will notice that gender is not one of those listed protected grounds, but gender has been used to sort of create a particular social group in combination with some other things. So for example, women who have sought higher education, that sort of thing. There's also potentially a religious claim, depending on the facts of the case. And so to prepare an asylum claim, first, you really need to sit down with the client multiple times, interview them, determine what their specific facts are and how the law will apply to those facts. And then we draft out their affidavit, which is their story of what happened to them and what they fear in their country in their own words. And then you have to gather client-specific evidence to support their story. So if they are making a claim based on the fact that they have attended higher education, you will at least attempt to get evidence of their enrollment. Any degrees or transcripts would be useful, possibly written testimony from family members, friends, professors, fellow students, people who can corroborate their story. If, for example, they suffered physical harm, if they sought medical treatment, getting copies of medical records, getting a medical evaluation to say, this scarring is consistent with their story of what happened to them, possibly a psychological evaluation to document any psychological impacts from trauma. And as you can imagine, particularly in the case of a country like Afghanistan, collecting some of that evidence may be difficult. A lot of the people who fled were not able to bring possessions with them on their transport flights out. And obviously getting documentation from inside the country is now really challenging. So you have to at least try so that you can show that it's not reasonably available. And then there's sort of more general evidence of what's going on in the country, because the well-founded fear has to be subjectively real. The person has to actually be afraid, and then it has to be objectively reasonable. Would a reasonable person in the client's position have that same fear? And the way that you show that is you say, you know, this is what's happening in the country. Here are State Department reports. Here are Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch reports on the harms that are being done to people who are in my client's position, news reports, all of that sort of thing. So once you get all of that together, you complete the asylum form, the I-589, and you submit that, and then you wait. As I will explain here in this next slide, it is a very lengthy process. So there are two sort of modes for asylum, I would call it. The first is affirmative asylum. So that's for people who are not in removal proceedings. They don't have a case in immigration court. They've perhaps entered on humanitarian parole and they're here. They apply affirmatively to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And that is then sent to the asylum office that has jurisdiction over the area where the person is living. For Atlanta, that office is in Arlington, Virginia. And we are what's called a circuit ride location, which means that officers from the asylum office in Arlington, Virginia will periodically come to Atlanta to conduct interviews. The asylum system is incredibly overburdened right now. The backlog is immense, and they are currently operating on a last in, first out scheduling scheme, meaning that they first schedule people whose applications have been filed within the last 21 days. And then if they're able to get all of those cases scheduled, then they might start on older cases. However, there are more cases being filed every day than they can schedule interviews for. So most of those people who file are not being picked up immediately, which means they go into a backlog that has essentially at this point no end in sight. Just a side note, we have obviously a large number of people who are fleeing Afghanistan who are going to be eligible for asylum who will be applying, and that's going to make the backlog worse. We also have the attempt to reduce the backlog at the immigration courts, resulting in people having their cases in immigration court dismissed, which means then that if they want to continue to pursue asylum, they would have to file affirmatively as well. So we're looking at a couple of different ways that we're going to be getting more people in that pipeline. So you submit your application after, I'm going to just say a certain amount of time because there is ongoing changes to the regulations and litigation. But after either 6 months or a year, if you haven't caused delays by missing a fingerprinting appointment or not going to an interview or moving from the jurisdiction of one office to another and having to have your case moved, then you're eligible to apply for work authorization. And that is taking quite a while. And we've seen a lot of erroneous denials of those cases, unfortunately. But so you, at least in theory, are able to work while you're in this backlog that's going to last, at this point, probably 6 to 7 years, unless something happens and there's a change in scheduling priorities or a major infusion of resources to the asylum offices that will allow them to process more cases. But once you are finally scheduled for an interview, you'll usually get 3 to 4 weeks notice. And you have to, at that point, probably supplement all of the things that you filed in the past, like what's going on in the country now, what's going on with the client now, all of that before the actual interview date. So, the trick is, unfortunately, there is a possibility that you might get your case picked up immediately. So you don't want to file something until you're ready. Asylum, unless there's a good excuse, needs to be filed within 1 year of entering the United States. So you need to have as much as possible ready when you file it, just in case it gets picked up immediately. And then you're also probably going to have to supplement what you filed later on if it's been pending for multiple years. But once there's an interview, then they will either grant asylum, that's an approval. If the person is in some other status, say student status or employment visa status, and they don't believe that that person merits asylum, they'll just deny the asylum and that person will maintain the other status that they were in. Or if that person is not in any other status, then they will refer them to immigration court. And so in that way, an affirmative application can become a defensive asylum case. So essentially defensive because it's your defense to deportation. So the asylum office, if they aren't going to grant asylum and this person doesn't have other status, will issue what's called a notice to appear. That's also the same document that might be issued if you are here undocumented and you have a run-in with ICE and they realize that you are removable from the United States. Once that has been issued, you'll be scheduled a hearing before the immigration court. You'll submit your asylum application and eventually be scheduled for an individual hearing with an immigration judge, and ICE will also be there as opposing counsel. The affirmative asylum process is a much friendlier interview with just the asylum officer. It's non-adversarial, and the Arlington Asylum Office has about a 40% grant rate. In immigration court, it is an adversarial position. There's cross-examination by ICE, and we have immigration judges that are generally not very amenable to granting asylum. It's either approved or denied by the immigration judge. If it's denied, you can appeal it to the Board of Immigration Appeals that sits in Falls Church, Virginia. If it's approved and ICE doesn't think it should have been, they can also appeal it to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And if you don't get the result you want at the Board of Immigration Appeals, then you have to file with the circuit court, the federal circuit court, that has jurisdiction over the area where the immigration court that issued the initial decision is located. So for us, that's the 11th Circuit. It's called a petition for review. And if you're not successful there, then the last stop would be a petition for certiorari with the US Supreme Court, which does not grant very many of those in any given year. So most people, to be perfectly honest, given the amount of resources required for a federal circuit appeal, most people, the Board of Immigration Appeals is kind of their final stop on the asylum pathway. And unfortunately, in recent years, the board has not been very immigrant friendly, although there have been some new people appointed who I'm hopeful will be more willing to interpret the laws in ways that are helpful to applicants for relief from deportation. So that's sort of the asylum process. There are some resources here for Afghans. GAIN is the Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network here in Atlanta. They do work with people who are applying for asylum, obviously victims of crime as well. And they have responded to the crisis in Afghanistan by creating Project Ally, which is a hotline for people to call and get advice. And it's also a pro bono network for people who are seeking help with applications for humanitarian parole. There's the International Refugee Assistance Project that has some really great resources, both for attorneys and for Afghans on their website. The link is there. I can post these in the chat when I'm done here. The American Immigration Lawyers Association has multiple chapters in cities all over the United States, and they have been organizing pro bono assistance for Afghans. And then there are a couple of other organizations that are doing a lot of advocacy work, Evacuate Our Allies and Save Our Allies. The Immigration Clinic is currently at capacity for individual client cases, but we are currently trying to figure out how best we might be able to create a project to get students in the clinic involved in providing some support, whether that be in the form of country conditions research or something else. So I'm in contact with a couple of our community partners to see if we can figure out a way that we might be able to contribute to providing assistance to the individuals who are here in the United States and needing to seek some sort of immigration status. So hopefully that was intelligible. I'm going to stop here and open things up for questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was really helpful just to have you kind of distill a lot of the information that, you know, I think I feel inundated by in the news. That was really constructive. I wanted to ask for your thoughts and kind of feedback about, you know, the kind of emotional challenges of the work that you and your students do in the immigration clinic and how you prepare students to do that work. You know, certainly I would assume that in your kind of conventional legal training, there's not probably a lot built into that curriculum around the kind of psychosocial and emotional toll that this type of work probably takes on you and your students, and just wondered if you could comment on that.
Sure. So this is something that we talk to our students about a lot. And I'm getting less and less resistance over time to talking about this stuff. But often in the past, I would have students say things like, well, it's not me that the bad things happen to, so I don't need to hear about, you know, making sure I take care of myself and that sort of thing. I think people are starting to realize that secondary trauma or burnout or compassion fatigue, whatever you want to call it, is real and the toll is real. And we are seeing incredible amounts of burnout, particularly in this field after the last 5 years or so. There's been a lot of burnout. And so that is something that I want to try to prepare my students for. And so we talk about the ways that dealing with, you know, hearing the stories about the horrible things that our clients have been through, realizing that this justice system that they've signed up for law school to become a part of doesn't necessarily provide justice. Seeing your client show up in court if they're detained in an orange jumpsuit with their hands shackled to a chain around their waist and their legs shackled together. Those things do affect us. And so we talk a lot about resilience and ways to build resilience. We talk a lot about the ways that secondary trauma can manifest itself in your life. And I encourage students to listen to their loved ones, because the toll is cumulative and it can be slow moving. And so when you're on the inside, so to speak, it can be difficult to note those changes. So, things like irritability, avoidance, stomach aches, headaches, lack of enjoyment in activities, withdrawal from loved ones and activities you enjoy. All of those things are things to look out for. And then we talk about things that we can do to create healthy boundaries and to take care of ourselves, and sort of maintain a bit of professional distance from the work that we're doing. It's especially hard because people who take the clinic, who get into this work, do it because they really care deeply about the people that they're serving. And so maintaining that distance can be a challenge. And so I think students have been quite receptive to that. There's some great resources. There's a book called Secondary Trauma by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky that I highly recommend, and is relevant not just to people who do legal work, but people who work in the medical field or environmental advocacy, anywhere where you're sort of bearing witness to trauma and harm. So that's sort of the tack we take, and it's something that we talk about from day one in the clinic.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Feel free, please, to raise your hand or just jump in.
Hey, Emily, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, my name's Ruthie. Thanks for all of the awesome information and putting this together. I really appreciate it. I am curious about the humanitarian parole visas that you mentioned, the P2 and P3. We've been a group of women have been working with a small group of Afghan women who we helped evacuate to the United States, and we're being told that they're falling under a P1 visa, or that's what their visa is. Can you go into what the difference is between a P1 and a P2? Because we're having a hard time finding information on a P1. We heard that it was a new visa created for this Afghan resettlement occurring, but we have little information on it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so it is, I think, pretty new, and so there isn't a lot of good information out there. But my understanding is that the P1 designation can be made either by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees or the US Embassy. And so that means that either a US government official has to know the person personally, or the individual has to register with the UNHCR, and it is classified as one of the most vulnerable refugees. At that point, they enter sort of the processing queue in the refugee resettlement process. They'll go through their interview and a variety of processes, and then a decision is made on whether or not to give them refugee status. Then there's the medical exam and fingerprints and cultural orientation, and then they'll figure out where in the US there's a resettlement agency that can take them, and at that point then they'll be able to come to the United States as a refugee, is my understanding. I don't know if that's helpful.
So it is. I just to follow on with that question really quick. So if they're currently located in the United States, so we have these girls across military installations, and some of them are being resettled to final destinations, and we're unsure of what visa status they're falling under. They technically don't apply for a civ, but we put in for them anyway, and we're being told now they're P1s. So would they be in a asylee status, or would they be in a refugee status here?
I have to be honest, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. Yeah, no worries.
Because my understanding of the P1 stuff is that it's for people who are outside the US in sort of the refugee context. But yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that question. I can see what I can find out for you. I don't know
Yeah,
if you
you're
wanna-
not the you're not the only one. I mean, there's like no information on this, so
yeah.
no, I appreciate it. But if you find anything, I can put my email in the chat, and if you don't mind sending me any information, if you do find it, I'd really
Sure,
appreciate it.
yeah, I will see what I can find out. But yeah, I think, there just may not be a process at this point, which I know is a really unsatisfying answer. But I think we were not prepared for this, as I'm sure we all know. And so a lot of this stuff is sort of being done on an ad hoc basis and makes it really hard to navigate for anyone, but especially someone who doesn't have an attorney and
Yeah,
you know.
Hey, Emily,
totally understand.
this
Thanks.
is Mary Helen, and Ruthie is a part of that amazing group of Army women that I've been advising. And so I think that question was like, of course we don't know, because I think they're making it up as we go along.
Yeah.
But what advice would you give us? I mean, I just reached out to somebody on base with the IRC and asked them if any P1s were getting refugee status, because it doesn't sound like they are. But if you could do any kind of asking around and just see what you can find out, that would be so great to help them, because they're trying to advise, because I know it's so crazy. They technically they technically should be civs, but they had to get them out so fast that they didn't complete the paperwork before they left Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, if that's the case, then they could potentially do the SIV status, here in the US. But I know that, there's the issue with the 1 year of working for the government, and, some people may not have made that, met that year.
How have they documented that in the past?
I mean, you mean the 1 year designation, or?
Well, I mean, I think some of the questions that we've gotten is, did they have a contract with the US military? I mean, did it have to be a contract, or how can they prove that they worked with the military? Like, what documentation can they provide?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my understanding is that there's, so they have to send their materials, whatever that means, to this email address at the State Department for approval by the Chief of Mission. And so, yeah, I guess that would be, I don't know. Obviously, if there was a contract, that would be great. That would be helpful. I'll be honest, I don't know necessarily what people are submitting for that either. I have not done a SIV myself. I know that there are sort of employment certification letters that are being used in the P2 context for people who work for NGOs. So it's possible that perhaps the people they work directly with could provide some sort of statement or documentation that they worked with them for whatever length of time. But I don't know for sure. But that's something else I can look into. Making myself a list here.
Thank you. What advice would you give these folks who are, or anyone who is mentoring or working with Afghan humanitarian parolees that are here? We're expected to receive 1,100 here in Georgia. I know that there are about 10 to 20 families arriving every week just through one resettlement agency. And I see the resources that you shared, but I get a lot of questions every single day, not about the resettlement stuff, but about the legal aspects. What advice would you give people who are asking questions about how they can help humanitarian parolees?
So, yeah, I think there are a variety of different agencies that are doing work. I mean, I think one of the big things is going to be advocacy. You know, Congress could pass legislation that could address this issue and give people a visa that's specifically for them. And they have done that in a variety of different contexts in the past. The most recent one I can think of off the top of my head is Liberia. So there was, a 1-year period where people who had been here from Liberia for decades on temporary protected status and then deferred and forced departure were able to apply for a green card through a fairly simple process. So that's definitely something that can be done.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because that's what I suggested too. So what does that look like? Reaching out to your elected officials in Congress?
Definitely. I think there are groups that are doing advocacy work that it might be most expedient to sort of join forces with. There's the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition, which is a large group of like the International Refugee Assistance Project, Human Rights First, Association of Wartime Allies, and then some advocacy agencies and some orgs that provide legal services. And they are looking for organizational members to join. They've, I guess, developed a strategy calling for the immediate evacuation of persons, and now are advocating for legal sort of solutions for people. Let's see, and they're advocating with the administration, with Congress, and then there's so I think that my advice would be to sort of get involved with a larger, there's a petition on the refugeerights.org, which is the International Refugee Assistance Project, where you can sign a petition and contact your elected officials. I'll put that in the chat here. I think obviously when you put all your voices together, the effect is greater. So joining forces with other groups that are already advocating, I think, is probably going to be the best way to get some impact.
Emily, my audio dropped off for a second. I had to rejoin, so I missed a little bit. I just was going through the chat and noticed that Michael, you put a question in, and I'm not sure you had a chance to answer it explicitly yet, although you could have touched on a few of these issues related just to like, what is the Afghan reality in Metro Atlanta specifically, and just wondered if in the next couple minutes you could just comment on kind of in our more immediate work life sphere here in Atlanta? What does that look like? And I know you guys have mentioned at the Immigration Clinic that you are at capacity, and just wondered if you could give us a sense about the lay of the land in our own city.
Yeah, so there are GAIN is one organization in our area that's doing work for people who are trying to get out of Afghanistan. There are a couple of Afghan attorneys in the area who are doing a lot of organizing and working to help people. There are, I think, New American Pathways is a resettlement organization that is receiving people here in the United States, in Atlanta, and trying to figure out sort of, I'm working with, there are some women coming to study in the intensive English program at GSU. And so GSU has been providing some resources for them and sort of trying to work now with GSU and New American Pathways to figure out sort of what resources are available for those individuals. I mean, I think I mentioned that we've got the Arlington Asylum office, which is, you know, a circuit ride location. So the reality for people who are submitting applications for affirmative asylum is, you know, going to be a lengthy process. Our immigration courts are notoriously unwilling to grant asylum to a lot of people. We have a bunch of new judges here in Atlanta, and so we actually don't have a lot of data on their grant rates. But you know, I haven't seen anything that indicates that it's going to be vastly different from the sort of status quo for the past many years here in Atlanta, where grant rates were somewhere between 2% and 4%. So, you know, that's definitely an issue. Yeah, we have CARE is a local nonprofit that has offices all over the world, and they have been working to try and get P2 designations for their employees who are working in Afghanistan. And one of my clinic students actually is a paralegal at CARE, and that's what she's been working on since Kabul fell. So, you know, there's a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts, but just still so much uncertainty, and a lot that, you know, I don't have answers to a lot of things, unfortunately, and I think I'm not the only one who doesn't have those answers.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
there's
like,
a lot of interest in helping. So I know that there are a lot of groups that are asking what they can do and wanting to help. So.
Yes, well, and I know you and your team are amongst those, and we thank you for all of your hard work to that end, and our cheerleaders for you and the clinic. So thank you for that, and thank you for presenting to us today. I think it was really informative and helpful, and thank you to everyone who attended. Emily, I'll follow up with you separately about recordings, and you know, if you are able and willing to share your slides, that might be helpful for us to just be able to refer to the nuts and bolts of some of that later on. And if there are any outstanding questions for Emily that you didn't have a chance to ask today, you know, please feel free to reach out to prc@gsu.edu, and we'll get those questions to Emily, and connect Emily to you directly. Thank you all so much for your time today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Emily.